Hello and welcome to Dialogue of Civilisations. What does constitute victory in war? What does victory look like at the end of a prolonged military confrontation? Although the question itself is perfectly legitimate and therefore should be asked and preferably answered too, it should not surprise anybody that there is no clear answer to it. There are definitional issues with tactical, strategic and grand strategic levels of war differing from each other. And victory is an eminently contestable notion. Defeating an opponent militarily is not always wholly identical to achieving the object of war, the reason for which the war was fought in the first place. A truly real and lasting victory requires the successful resolution of deeper problems lying at the heart of a given conflict. Tactical gains should never be made at the expense of losing great strategic triumphs. In the field of human conflict and in the context of the ongoing battle involving Russia and Ukraine, the very central question is how one should frame victory and defeat. Could we or should we consider Russia, whose evident strategic aim is far beyond gaining control over certain portions of Ukraine, extending to having Kyiv firmly within its realm of influence, victorious for the time being? And should we see modern Ukraine's current predicament, potentially involving territorial concessions, in conjunction with its prospective gain in the shape of an opportunity, the mere promise of which is far greater than the magnitude of this nation's current losses, temporary or permanent? My guest today is Professor Borja de Aristegui, Professor of International Relations and Geopolitics at the Institute of Business and at St. Louis University. Professor, welcome to Dialogue of Civilisations.
Pleasure being here.
Thank you, Professor. This may sound a rhetorical question, but it is not meant to be one. Who is winning today in Ukraine on the battlefield? And
Mr. Amashov, I couldn't agree more with the introduction that you gave. The answer to this question is actually quite complicated and complex in the sense that if we take into consideration the developments at the level of the international system, when we talk about perhaps the apparent concessions that Mr. Trump has given to Mr. Putin, then it might seem that the winner is clearly today the Kremlin. However, things are a little bit more complex than that. It is true that the different developments that we have had in world politics, particularly since the Munich conference of last week, have made us rethink the way in which we perceive our world order to be. A lot of analysts and pundits have started to argue that indeed this seeming concession on the part of President Trump to Putin has completely reorganized the way in which international politics and geopolitics play out at this international level. On the one hand, it seems like Mr. Putin is agreeing to grant Mr. Putin a sphere of influence, right? As a sphere of power, as we say in the geopolitical field. A little bit, perhaps, in order to get his own hemispheric sphere of influence recognized by the international community, and in particular by these powers that are seeking to how do I put this, to perhaps reframe the way in which we carry out international politics at this level. Indeed, Mr. Xi, Mr. Putin, Mr. Lavrov in multiple occasions have told us that the unipolar world is an unnatural world. And if we take into consideration the first interview that Mr. Rubio as Secretary of State gave a few weeks back, he did seem to agree with these positions that our geopolitical architecture that we have been constructing since 1945 and then obviously expanded after 1991 is changing. If we take this into consideration, it might seem at first glance that Putin is winning. However, as you very well pointed out, sir, the answer is a little bit more complex.
Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher and playwright, once said that once you hear the details of a victory, it is hard to distinguish it from a defeat. What are the key non-negotiable components of that which would mean a solid Ukrainian victory? What are those elements that cumulatively would form what we may confidently call Ukrainian victory?
Ukraine needs security guarantees. The shape of these may vary, but without concrete security guarantees on the part of first the European partners of Kiev, and then obviously with an American backstop, that could be considered a defeat for the Ukrainian aspirations.
And you would say that a joint expeditionary force involving UK and other powers and French troops, so cumulatively those two forces, boots on the ground with American backstop, altogether would make a solid security guarantee for Ukraine. Is that what you said?
It would be a start.
It would be a start.
It would be a start, sir, because what we need to take into consideration is that boots on the ground in Ukraine, on the part of any Western country, is a massive defeat for Kremlin interests. Let's not forget that right before the invasion of 22, we had already Ukraine offering what was deemed at the time a Finland-like pact. Let's not forget that during the Cold War, Finland was neutralized by treaty, and Ukraine had already agreed to become a neutral state in the international system as long as its territorial integrity would be respected. So if we have boots on the ground of any sorts on the part of the Western powers, be them British, be them French, be them American, or whatever combination of these that you may want, that already is a massive defeat for a dictator who honestly was simply arguing that it was NATO expansion that had forced his hand in this respect. Another thing that would demonstrate this defeat of Russian strategic interest in this sense is that if what Mr. Putin had wanted was to stop NATO expansion, then these operations that he's conducted in Ukraine that has not only made that Russia has incurred in massive losses, has also resulted in two previously neutral countries joining NATO in the shape of Sweden and Finland. So if we have any sort of peace in this sense, it would have to be considered a significant win for Ukraine and a defeat for the Kremlin's interests.
Let's try to look at the circumstance on the ground from Russia's perspective. Vladimir Putin, Russian president, is said to care not so much about Ukrainian territory and the extent of direct Russian control over it as such, but wider issues involving a more comprehensive deal that will keep Ukraine out of NATO, will limit the size of Ukraine's military forces, will reduce the Western alliance's presence across Eastern and Central Europe. And another question is, begs to be asked and probably answered too. The question is, what does victory look like for Russia then?
Well, Mr. Amashov, in my opinion, victory for Russia looks very unlikely at this point. Mm-hmm. Despite the different narratives that have been distributed and propagated by the Kremlin's machinery, what we have is a massive strategic defeat on the part of the Kremlin. One, what Mr. Putin had intended with the 2022 invasion was to get overall control of the entirety of the Ukrainian territory. Not simply the Donbass provinces and the southern provinces bordering the Black Sea. So that in and on itself is already a defeat. Second, we saw a strengthening of NATO, an expansion of NATO with the joining of Finland and Sweden. Three, what we're having is a complete revamping of the security structures in Europe. We have heard Mr. Merz, the likely Chancellor of Germany come next summer, that the June summit of NATO will put a limit to the different recalibrations of the security architectures that we have in Europe at this moment. He will find a very willing partner in Mr. Macron and in Ms. Meloni, and most likely also in Mr. Tusk in Poland. So that will result in a complete revamping of this security architecture from a European context. So if we take all this into consideration, this is clearly, even in these dire moments of Western unity and the frailty of the transatlantic alliance, already a defeat for the Kremlin.
We'll go back to that point about transatlantic alliance a bit later. In terms of great power politics, there seems to be a growing concern that, for all their differences, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump somewhat see today's world in a similar way, based upon the creed that Russia and the United States are two great nations that should negotiate Ukraine's fate bilaterally without involving Ukraine itself. And also they have to address weightier global affairs as well. Do you share the concern of those people who believe that there is a degree of commonality between Trump and Putin, and this commonality could be expressed in this fashion?
There's definitely an alignment in the way in which they perceive systemic politics. This being said, what we see here is not really two equals talking to one another. Let's not forget that the economy of Russia is slightly larger than that of Spain. It is smaller than that of Italy. And the only thing that has kept Mr. Putin going has been his capacity to keep selling hydrocarbon products at a premium. So we need to be careful when we talk about great power politics. There is definitely a hierarchy of power in which the United States obviously takes the lead, and then we have a second player that is China. But Russia by no means can be considered a great power given the circumstances, particularly taking into consideration that it has not been able to, in 3 years of conflict, to completely erase and dominate the fierce resistance of Kiev.
And Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister, statesman known for his passionate and steadfast support and effective support for President Zelensky in Ukraine, has recently stated that it is bonkers to say that Ukraine started the war in relation to what Trump suggested a few days ago. And he sort of criticized Donald Trump, adding that he still believes, and Boris Johnson still believes that, and I would like to quote him, he said, "There is a method in President Trump's sadness as madness that could see Ukraine out of this trouble." How do you interpret that language, madness in the method of Donald Trump? How do you interpret that?
I think that Mr. Johnson is being very kind to Mr. Trump in this sense. He's probably referring to the possibility that what seems to be Trump's strategy in this respect and many others is to create as much chaos as possible to try to reap the benefits of a particular objective that they might have further down the line out of all the chaos created. However, to proceed in this way and in this manner in terms of geopolitics, when hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost, when the entire future of a nation such as Ukraine is on the line, is first of all disrespectful, 2, immoral, and 3, frankly, dangerous.
Something quite extraordinary happened with regard to rule of law, international legal order, and transatlantic alliance. the United States joined Russia to vote against a UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's war against Ukraine, which was considered by many a stunning shift from years of US foreign policy. So, as we remember, original US proposal, which was later amended, of course, states that US implores a swift end to the conflict. It begs for swift end to the conflict and urges for a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. And there's a language there also entailed the element about that mourning the tragic loss of life throughout the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. It reiterated the principal purpose of the United Nations as expressed in the Charter to maintain international peace and security and so forth, without mentioning aggression, without mentioning full-scale invasion and some other elements. First of all, I would like you to comment on this very visible, perceptible and palpable rift at the heart of transatlantic alliance. US is siding with Russia against its European allies. What do you make of this situation?
This is probably the biggest strategic blunder on the part of any US president in history. The one advantage that the United States had during the Cold War and then later, for example, in comparison to powers such as the Soviet Union and then Russia and then China, was its capacity to make friends. When you simply disregard this alliance, when you simply disregard this partnership, you turn away on your biggest strength in the process in the competition based on geopolitics and strategic interests. And this will be an element that will be studied in generations to come. This is a turning point in transatlantic relations, and we will see this with what I mentioned before with Mr. Merz's and Mr. Macron's and Mrs. Meloni's alignment in terms of turning Europe into a strategic autonomous entity, to utilize the vocabulary that Mr. Macron uses. So what you mentioned before, this realignment in the United Nations is not only a blunder, and a strategic blunder at that, but it is also the result of a certain debate that has been going on in world politics that has us reestablish or actually renegotiate the different values that underpin the concept that we have behind international society. And the years that are to come are going to be vital, but hopefully they could or they can be reversed if and when we have a different administration in 4 years.
And how likely is it that some form of deal could be attained between Ukraine and Russia? And the fundamental question is, if Ukraine is forced to territorial concessions by means of signing legally binding document, what would this mean for international law and for the concept of the rule of law in general? Because we're talking about a sovereign country, the 20% of territory of which is under foreign control, and we understand that it is currently under pressure to sign a deal which Ukraine is probably unwilling to sign. And if that deal entails legally binding provision related to territorial concession in connection with that 20% of territory, what would that mean for international legal order?
So basically, sir, what we have here is this renegotiation of sovereignty as an institution that has been the main pillar over which we have constructed international society over the past 7 decades. With this renegotiation, what we will have is probably a more unstable system. Let's not forget that our common understanding of what sovereignty entails, with a common recognition, with an assumption that one's territory is integral to their survival, and with this agreement that that non-intervention in each other's affairs was actually a valuable element that would actually conduct us towards more stability in the system and therefore more peace. So what we will have, if this is the case, is one step forward in this renegotiation towards more instability in the system. You asked me what does a deal look like? Well, there's a difference between a deal and simple surrender. Mr. Zelensky has stated in multiple occasions that he's willing to give territorial concessions as long as Ukraine's sovereignty remains respected in the rest of the territory, and particularly that certain security assurances are made for the future of Ukraine, be it in the form of NATO accession or EU accession, or even a more flexible agreement. If this is achieved, then this might be an acceptable outcome for Kiev, but it is unlikely. And what seems like the most likely option, and what Mr. Trump has been defending for the last few days, is a surrender of Ukraine to the aspirations of the Kremlin, which in this case would be a surrender of Kiev's possessions and therefore a victory for Moscow. A relative victory for Moscow, because we already said that this war has resulted in a significant strategic defeat for the Kremlin.
Professor Borja de Aristega, I'm very grateful to you for your time and for your answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Well, so long as the fate of Ukraine is concerned, it is hanging in the balance. The United States, United Kingdom and the European Union are not going to let Russia defeat Ukraine roundly as such. Consequently, Moscow will not be allowed to enjoy a complete victory. Quite a few ponderables remain unresolved, with the most central question being what victory would look like in Ukraine. Looking forward to welcoming you to the next episode of Dialogue of Civilizations.